Hey, what's up? My name is Clay, and I'm happy to be back with another episode of the Enneagram Prison Project podcast. This week we're going to talk about the Enneagram in prison and how that might compare to the corporate world or anywhere else where you might learn or teach the Enneagram. Also, Susan is going to detail the 8-week curriculum and what that looks like as an inmate going through the course from 1 week to the next. At the end of those 8 weeks, then what happens? Are the inmates just given a certificate and sent on their merry way, or are they allowed to go through the class a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time, perhaps? As usual, we would love to hear from you. Leave us a comment, send us a message, an email, carrier pigeon, whatever you prefer. But please be in touch with us and let us know how we're doing, what you might want to see on future episodes, as well as what you think about this episode. And speaking of which, here we are with episode 3 of the Enneagram Prison Project podcast. With the Enneagram Prison Project, you know, it's pretty self-explanatory by the name what it is the organization does. We take the Enneagram and teach it in prison, right? So I'm wondering, and I'm sure other people are wondering, exactly what does that look like when you take the Enneagram into prison versus a corporate environment or something else like that?
Yeah, great question. I don't think I change the content of what I'm teaching in terms of the Enneagram all that much. I don't actually think that I'm able to change it all up like that. I think that I use some of the same stories and some of the same explanations. It's the same system because I think people are just people, and that's why it works so well. And but there are a few things that I think are key that I do bring in jail and in prison environments right away that I might take a little bit longer to bring in the corporate world. And mostly that's because I think that people in jail and prison are really ready to go there. They're really ready to do some real work. That's why we're there in the class in the first place. And in the corporate world, you know, maybe they're there because their boss told them they had to be there, and we kind of take a little time. I take my time a little bit differently. Yeah. But one of the first things that I bring in with me in terms of our 8-week curriculum is like week 1 is kind of a container building, talking about what are my expectations and how do I work. And one of the most important pieces to that, I think, is what I call our emotional responsibility agreement, which is something that I borrowed from my therapist with her permission because she had me sign one, and I thought it was so good. And she asked me this question. This was years ago. She asked me if I was willing to take 100% responsibility, emotional responsibility. And I actually was a little annoyed by the question because I thought, of course I'm willing to take responsibility. You know, I'm here, right? I'm paying you. And I realized that I was willing to take responsibility for how I felt about things until I decided, like, my husband was a jerk that day. And so then everything that I felt was suddenly his fault. And that was where that agreement became very important because, of course, my perception of somebody else's behavior is only that. And I
do you
have
find
to take
guys in prison, are they receptive to the emotional responsibility agreement, or does it take them, like, do you ever have guys who just say, no, it's not my fault, I'm out, I'm not, if this is where I have to start, then forget about it?
I haven't had anybody do that yet, and I explained it a lot like I'm explaining it now. So I really, I'm aware, and I have felt in therapy and with other people who know other modalities, that there's sort of this rug about to be pulled out from under me anxiety that people can have, and that I understand because I have had it too. Like, what do you know that you're setting me up for? So I let people know that exactly that. Like, I'm willing until you're a jerk, and then actually, hey, I'm out. And then they kind of laugh, and people appreciate, I think, candor and saying, well, this is what I'm asking you to agree to. But because it's all pretty neutral, no one's triggered particularly, I don't think. People are kind of curious about what they're getting into. And we talk about the difference between or the importance of understanding what shame is, that, like, I am bad because of what I did, and that's not obviously where we come from. And guilty is I did something bad and I have a remorse about it, but shame is like I am bad. And I really want them to know that when they are using that self-hatred kind of language, I'm going to call them on it because it's not a loving, kind way to heal.
Do you ever find that as the weeks go on and people, do you ever find that they slip back into this blame game, and you can actually point back to that agreement and say, wait a second, this we're not going down this road because you agreed to this. And if you do use that, do you ever what does that look like when, because I would think that eventually somebody in some class is gonna have that thought pattern or that thought process come back up.
Oh yeah, very quickly, maybe even the end of that class or the next hour. I mean, definitely that's how we all are. We can agree to all kinds of stuff, but we're so conditioned. That's part of the reason why we're all in the class and why we want to study it. So I just but I think there's a fine balance there where you can't shame somebody for using shameful language. Right? Mm-hmm. That's like not gonna ever help. So I always try to let people know, like, do you hear yourself? And when I hear you talk that way, I feel sad for that person inside of you that you're treating like that. Or I kind of put it in a way that hopefully is more palatable. It was interesting, just this past week though, we were talking about the inner critic. And I was trying to help people to chart the language that they use and how they talk to themselves. And not just the ones have strong inner critics, right? We all have one. And so they were writing down literally the things they say to themselves, and the energy in the room was so low, and it just feels so icky. Mm-hmm. And then I was asking them to reframe the different statements or ways that they were talking to themselves. And one guy wrote, "What the F is wrong with you?" That's what he says to himself. And I said, well, what would be a kinder way to talk to yourself? And he thought about it for a second, and he said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" And I thought, that's how it is, right? Like, we really have a hard time thinking of something nicer, even when we're trying.
That's one thing that you're really good at, is taking something like, what the F is wrong with me? And then by the end of the conversation, and you're not just forcing things into people's brains, like you're actually, taking them down this path of thinking, learning how to think differently, or learning how to reframe it, as you said. And one thing I've heard you ask this question a ton of times is that true? So when someone says, what the F is wrong with me? I'm so screwed up, and you say, is that true? And you're not telling them that's not true, and you're not telling them anything. You're just you're pointing it out to them that go a little deeper and find out, is what you're saying actually true? And so how did the rest of the conversation go with him? Did he where did it go from there?
Yeah, well, I love that question. And that comes from Byron Katie's work, where I just think she's brilliant. She's simple little questions where we get really curious about each and every one of those thoughts that we have. I think she does the Enneagram. She just does it thought by thought. Mm-hmm. And this guy is a four. And we have, interestingly, 4 4s in one class right now. And that's a lot in one room. It's often a lot in jail. And I'm always learning too, Clay, about how to do it. I'm running a panel, but it's live people, and I never really know what's going to come. But I do know that that's a good place to start, is to be curious about what people bring. And I'm not a 4, but I have a line that goes there, so I have some understanding. I remember later on during that class, after the inner critic part, I was asking the 4s how they see the world, and I was talking about their need to be connected, and all 4 of them were adamant that they don't care what other people think, that they don't need to be connected. And of course, I understand there's some defense right out of the bag. So I was letting them feel the way they feel, which is they don't care what other people think. Mm-hmm. But as we went on with it, I started to talk about, the image that people have of you, and that somehow seemed more objective, and they could talk about the importance of that, like wanting to be driving down being in a hot car and noticing people's attention go to my car, that kind of thing. So that we could kind of peel in these different layers. And at some point, I said something about how the need to be different was the thing that was driving the 4, instead of just being able to sit in the unique way that I know that I am. It's like the attention going to trying to be different. And I said, of course, that's the thing that 4s need to come to grips with, is that they are extraordinary. They don't have to invent themselves to be extraordinary. And putting it more in this way, I think the objectivity of talking about a type is the thing that makes it so much easier for all of us to admit to, right? And so there was a shift there, and then you could see. So I don't have a direct thing about what this guy said later that was kinder, but you could sort of energetically see it seeping in. Like they're all like, yeah, I do that. And there was like a shift in rather than having to defend it, but rather to be able to explore it.
Yeah. So 8 weeks is the curriculum, and it starts off, you said, with the emotional responsibility agreement in week 1. And as the next couple weeks go by, what does it look like for week 2, week 3, week 4?
Well, the other important part of building that container in week 1 is I tell them with a lot of kindness, I think, and compassion that I'm not attached to what type they are, and that they can change their mind. That's part of the deal, that we're figuring it out as we go. But I am very insistent that they pick something. And I say it all class long. I let them know that that's their homework, that they have to pick a type, and they have the Wisdom of the Enneagram book, so they can take the test in there. They also have the Essential Enneagram test from Dr. Daniel's book, and they have each other. And I tell them, you absolutely have to pick something, because when you think about it, there's a lot of safety in saying, I don't really know yet. And there's a lot of control in not being sure. So I let them know that's not going to fly. And then the next week when they come back, almost everybody does. And it's so cool. And I learned this the hard way from being way too nice for way too long, is that it's not very productive to teach a class of people who don't pick a type, because there's no work happening.
Right.
Yeah.
And even if they mistype themselves, I mean, there's always the freedom to go back and realize to yourself, I picked the wrong type. I'm actually not a this, I'm a that. And I'm sure that happens sometimes too, but there's still that benefit of having a defined starting point of some sort, even if it's not the most accurate.
Well, God, we want so badly to have an identity. You know, it's funny to me. It's really funny to me that people who can't pronounce Enneagram have never heard of it in their whole lives.
Yeah.
2 weeks in are really attached to whatever type they picked the week before. Yep. And, it kind of happens often, I think, with the 8, because the 8 is a tough, image type, and in jail it's nice to have that as your identity. But people are so, onto you. And if you're in the wrong type, it doesn't really work. It doesn't really work in the Enneagram community on the outside either. But people kind of get busted. And so I've become more persistent, I think, with people who I feel may not be in the right or in the accurate territory, because I think it's such a disservice to leave somebody with a tool as phenomenal as the Enneagram is in the wrong type and then let them go on their way. I just think I find people, even in the Enneagram community, who shift types, and they say that when they moved from one to the other, the one that was really them, like that's when everything opened up. That's when everything was so much more helpful. So we really push in a gentle, kind way. And it's nice to have other teachers come in and visit in the room, especially other types, because they can help me to do that.
I think also that's one of the things that's really cool about teaching, about using the panels, because like the prison where I learned the Enneagram, there's a ton of guys. There was well over 100 guys, and most of them knew the Enneagram pretty well. So you could have, for example, I'm a 5, so I could see that when, a panel of 5s, I can relate to them, and they're answering questions the way that I would answer them. And the same is true as if I had mistyped myself. If I thought I was a 7 or something like this, and I see a panel full of 7s and I don't relate to them at all, it kind of tips me off that, hey, maybe I need to go and figure this out a little bit more, because it's not that we're all the same, but we do share certain characteristics and a certain energy about ourselves when we're in our type.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's, I think, really the first school I certified with was with Palmer Daniels. And of course, they're really huge with the narrative tradition. That's a big ace in the hole when you can bring in other people. So when we can draw on graduates and have a panel that way, that's really nice. In weeks 2, 3, and 4, in the first container week, they, in addition to taking responsibility for their emotions and starting to understand that they're going to have to pick a type, I do a really kind of down and dirty quick all the way around the Enneagram so that people can get a sense of all the different ones and that how it all works systemically. And then week 2, I start to break it down more slowly, and we do this by centers. So we work with 8, 9, and 1, and then week 3 and 4 we do the heart triad, and then the not by centers. We do it, 8, 9, 1, and then we do 2, 3, 4, and then 5, 6, 7 over the next 4 weeks, so that people can do it more slowly. And I have really feel lucky that the administration in both jails where I work are very willing to allow us to bring in other visitors, and I think that's been really an amazing part of the Enneagram Prison Project growing, because people that come in as visitors are often just as moved by the guys as the guys are moved by them. And it reminds the guys that there's really a lot of people out there in the world that care. There are people that are like me that are struggling with their personality. They understand the Enneagram so much more. And then the visitors that come in, sometimes they're Enneagram teachers, sometimes they're just Enneagram enthusiasts. They leave and they're really quite touched. And many of them have stayed around and become more and more involved in the project. So that's really cool.
So, and once you pass, you're into it 5, 6 weeks. I know when week 6 rolls around, there's something a little different about week 6 than the rest of the weeks, because that's when you really you ask 3 pretty big questions, I think, and it speaks specifically to someone who is incarcerated. Because, I'll just let you. What are those 3 questions?
Yeah, the 3 questions we really are building up to being able to help them to answer is, how did my type contribute to my incarceration? And how is knowing this pattern of this type about myself helping me to heal? And how will knowing the pattern of my personality help me in my reentry? And honestly, it's not like we don't ask that question until week 6. I actually sometimes ask it in class 1, because it's the only reason that it's the big reason that I'm wanting to teach the class. I want people to be able to connect the dots between what I do and what's good about that, and what also gets me into trouble with that. It's like the reason that people get hired for the type is the reason that they're often people get tired of them too, or get fired. So it's the same for all of us, and we're always struggling with it. It's not like a secret question, but people can't quite even understand, I think, where we're moving to. So I try to help people to see the positive aspects about themselves, and I try to hold that in a really kind and compassionate way. And people are really the ones that are quick to bring in the negative stuff. People are quick to dive back into that. Yeah, but this is the problem with it. And so after we've really digested all those types in those first 4 weeks, everybody's pretty much in the right territory by then. And then week 5, we talk more explicitly about the defense mechanisms and how the defense that they have works in tandem with the identification as a strategy, and also the avoidance. And a lot of that comes from Peter O'Hanrahan's work, which I love. And that is a very juicy class. It's really pivotal, and we do some exercises in there that allow them to, in a playful way, start to see, oh God, I do have defenses even when I'm not even having anything to defend. And then, week 6 is quite pivotal, because we've connected and bonded a lot by then. A lot has been shared in the room. People are so candid about themselves. And then when they can, go ahead, Clay.
I was going to say, in 6 weeks might sound like it's not that much time, but when you're locked up, the time on the inside goes. It's kind of funny. I don't know if you're anybody who ever went to like summer camp as a kid. You can not know another kid. You could meet them on Monday, and they're your best friend in the world by Friday, because you live together in that camp environment for 5 days, and you just get to know people a lot more quickly, and a lot more. You make friends and enemies a lot quicker that way. And prison is exactly the same. So 6 weeks goes by, and it might not seem like it's that much time, a couple hours every week in class, but these guys are living together and getting to know each other much differently than you do out here in the free world. So by the time week 6 rolls around, it's a room full of men and women who know each other pretty dang well, actually. And so that conversation, the 3 questions that you mentioned earlier, is pretty. It could be pretty heavy,
Yeah,
and
they're in such intimate space. I mean, right now, one of the classes, both of the jails we're at, people are kind of stacked up in there. I mean, there's a room full of, 3 or 4 bunk beds, right? And they're all in one spot, and the walls are glass. There's no privacy, and it's tough. I mean, I think about traveling in a car with my family for 5 hours, and that can be tough, right? I mean, it is so, I look at that and I think, God, that would be really, really hard. So they've got plenty of material to bring into class and to look at themselves about. You don't have to be doing anything other than your normal life. I mean, this one too this week was telling me about how he doesn't like TV, doesn't care about TV, doesn't watch TV, but he finds himself at the TV, being a manual antenna trying to make sure everybody can watch TV. Yeah. And then he was able to see that in himself. So just the self-observation comes pretty quickly. Even one time recently, we came in on a Monday with the book, and then we came back on Tuesday, and the people were able to be so self-witnessing. It's very, very fast. But I think the beauty of the 8-week class can also be that there's this space in between to see it and observe it and practice putting it down, and then to be integrating things as we go.
Why is it so important when you ask, for people to talk about how their type contributed to their incarceration? Why is that such a big deal to understand? Because they're already incarcerated, so it's not like they can go back and change anything. So what's the point in talking about it?
Well, I think that you can't change anything that you can't see. And so there's something very important that happens when people are first able to know that they have a pattern and to see where it's operating, and then to see in hindsight, where did that not work? And then to be able to see how it could change. And it doesn't mean, and I don't want anyone to have the impression that people need to change their personality. You can't anyway. Right. Like, we're stuck with it. Yeah. But if you can see that we have the healthy manifestation of our pattern, and we also have that thing that we're good at that we drive into the ground until people want to kill us for it, we got that too. So if you can go look back and say, wow, this way of, sevens often get in trouble with drugs, and it's so classic to me in a way, right? Like, I'm struggling inside of myself, and often, by the way, this comes from abuse, and I don't want to be with me, so I'm looking for something to distract myself from myself. And when all of my antics don't work, just as a busy, seven who's looking at all these different opportunities, then I might reach for a drug, and then that doesn't work either. And in this addiction, right, addiction to drugs and addiction to myself, my own personality, if I can start to see that happens way before I'm reaching for, substance, then I can see actually the freedom is inside. So it's so important to slow it down and connect those different parts. I mean, Richard Rohr says, how we do anything is how we do everything. Yeah. Is so true.
Do you find, because the way, our type kind of drives how we live our life, but, a lot of people, I've been asked this question more than a few times, that, your type definitely contributes to your incarceration. There's no doubt about that. But do you find that there's any sort of I wouldn't say common thread, but, like you say, the seven might reach for drugs, or like this type might do that. Do you find that certain types are getting in trouble for similar things, or is it just kind of all over the board?
I have a lot of anecdotal data, if you will, about this, and I don't want to say anything too much because people tend to take a soundbite and really run with it. But I do find that certain types, it's not surprising when you see what they're in trouble for, how, like, nines often get in trouble for not doing anything, right, for being with the wrong crowd and not doing anything, because they want to belong and they don't want to be the guy who says whatever, and then by association, they are guilty too. And I think that people would be surprised that the most common type I find in jail or prison is actually not the eights, and it's not the sevens, and it's not even the counterphobic sixes, it's the twos. Yeah. And I think that twos often get in trouble by doing things, by helping people too much, and being in the wrong place, knowing they're in the wrong place, knowing they're doing too much. Twos and nines actually have told me many times that they are doing time for somebody else. If somebody else was guilty, but they didn't want to out their friend. So kind of like that. I don't know if that's helpful.
It is. And of course, I hear things, just to play, like I've said before, the devil's advocate. When I hear that, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who is very new to this, and so when I hear that, the thing I'm just going to tell you, the first thing that comes to mind is are they really doing time for other people, or are they blaming other people and they're just using that as an excuse? I mean, how much of that is they're really just being themselves and it gets them in trouble?
Yeah, I mean, good question, and probably both. Probably a little bit of both. How honest can we really get with ourselves? Um, that's really it,
Yeah.
and what's true anyway. Am I doing somebody else's time? Am I doing my own time? Well, you're the one sitting here. So whose fault is it? Who
Yeah.
chose to do this? Nobody could have made you do that time for somebody else. You somehow, played a part in that. But
Yeah.
what part are you willing to own? And it's a process. It's like it is for all of us. How much are we really willing to look at ourselves?
Well, good. I don't like to. That feels like a confrontational question to ask. I don't think that way anymore. I'm a big fan of taking responsibility for the things that you've done, and I do think that if you've done something to get yourself in prison, then you're the one who made that choice. But our personality does really contribute to that. I mean, it's like with me. I'm a 5, so a lot of people know that. What got me to prison was just this unending curiosity of if I could do something or if I could get away with this. And it wasn't even about crime or feeding an addiction of any sort. It was just about can I outthink, law enforcement? And that for me, that was my glitch, so to speak. So
Right.
So after week 6 and you've only got a couple weeks left, what do the last 2 weeks of class look like?
Well, week 6 and 7, those magic questions, those span over 2 weeks, and sometimes they bleed into a little bit to the 8th week, and they start a little bit in the 5th week because it's a lot of conversation. By then, it's not. It's way less of me talking or teaching. It's a lot more of me reflecting back what people say and then putting it in the context of their type, helping them to connect the dots, reminding them about the pattern. Just think about when you first learn the Enneagram, there's 9 types, is so much information. And if you can just kind of barely get a hold of your own deal, that's enough. But then they're all trying to kind of map the system and understand themselves and understand how they connect to each other. So a lot is processing. It's almost like group therapy. Some people have told me I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained as one, but I can definitely hold the space in a way where people feel like they can share things, and a lot gets communicated. And then week 8, we like to have a little bit of hoopla. It depends on the jail and the particular class and what's going on. We like to bring in people who are curious about the project to be supportive about the graduation. They read or they share sort of the succinct answer to those 3 questions, and they talk about sort of what's been the most impactful thing to them. All of the graduates do. We recognize graduates who have taken the class once and then taken it again. We've had some people take the class, up to 5 times. I think Victor Soto and Tom Papa both took it a lot because they were doing a whole bunch of time. Yeah. And we've had the assistant sheriff and the captain come in before. We've had program managers come in and own a type and talk about why the Enneagram is meaningful for them. We give people who are have taken the class more than once little sort of incentives to take it to stick around, and sometimes we are able to give them their own book. We want to make them feel special. We've had San Mateo County has been amazing. They have allowed them to bring in home-baked cookies that happen at the camp. Oh, wow. So some of the guys that have graduated and gone someplace else are able to kind of stay connected like that. I mean, they sound like small things. They're not. They're big things. And people really appreciate the visitors. They appreciate being recognized. We make them Suzanne Dion makes them a beautiful certificate that's not like a Office Max thing you get. Yeah. That's personalized and that's signed by the board.
And those are nice, by the way. They're not just some little flimsy piece of paper, because I've actually I've seen them before, and they're pretty cool. And those are a big deal. Even if you've gone through the class multiple times, I mean, it's every time you go back through it, you're going to learn something new. So it's not like you're just taking an easy class over and over and over again. I mean, you're going to get something from it. Like you said, Vic and Tom, they 5 times each. I mean, and they would tell you. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I'm pretty confident that they would say that every time they went through it, there was something else that made it worthwhile. There was something else that they learned about themselves or just the system in general. So it's not just 8 weeks and then you're done. I mean, that's just the beginning. And then it keeps, it's ongoing. Anybody who knows the Enneagram knows that you don't just learn it and then you're done. I mean, it's an ongoing process.
And it helps us to see, too, who are the ambassadors that are going to get out? Who do we identify with somebody who's really committed? We look at that.
Do you ever hear from people after they've gone through the class? And I mean, do you ever have any sort of testimonial or anything like that you've heard from people?
Yeah, a lot. We have a lot of people more and more people who are contacting us as they get out. I think it's kind of like a funnel, you know. I think people underestimate, like I do too. You're on vacation, you think, oh, this is great. Not that jail is vacation, but you're in some other environment is what I want to say, where you might read things and focus on yourself in a way that you don't when you're in your ordinary life. But then when we come back, I mean, re-entry, whether it's getting out of jail or coming back to your regular life from some trip you've been on, it's a flood of regular things that people need from you. Children need things. School has to happen. Got to go to work. Need money. Got to pay the rent. All that stuff just comes back hard. And so not everybody contacts us, and we're working now hard. Rick Olesic has been putting together different teams, and one of our teams is the reentry team, and that's really figuring out what do people need so that when they finish this class they can come out and stay connected rather than feel like, oh, that Enneagram thing, I gotta put that book up on the shelf because now I have to do my real life. The Enneagram is about your real life, and we want people to remember that. So yeah, people do stay connected, and I love it when people call.
So there you have it. Hopefully you learned something new today about EPP and what it's like as an inmate going through the class and what you can expect from one week to the next over the course of those 8 weeks. So hopefully you will join us again next week. We're going to have an extra guest with us. It'll be extra special. Vic Soto is going to join us and talk about his time in EPP and what it was like going through the class, not once, not twice, but 5 times. So anxious to hear what he has to say about that. Until then, I hope you have a good week, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Enneagram Prison Project podcast.